Hi, I'm Ryan Malone. I'm the composer for the Lamentations of Jeremiah Oratorio. And I wanted to make a short video just to help listeners before they experience this work. This helps anytime we experience art. Maybe you go to a concert and you hear a little pre-concert talk, someone alerting you to aspects of the music that would help as you experience it. So that's what I wanted to do in this short video here. The Book of Lamentations is this masterful composition in the Hebrew Bible, and it's 5 poems, 4 of which are organized in an alphabetical acrostic. So each verse starts with the next letter of the Hebrew alphabet. And it's commonly accepted that this work was written by Jeremiah, and most of it appears to be a reaction to the destruction of Jerusalem in around 585 BC, which he would have been an eyewitness to much of what happened there. There are indications in the Hebrew Bible that this was to be sung, which fascinates me as a composer, to take lyrics from the ancient world and then place them in a musical setting for our ears today. I've done this with other musical passages of the Bible, but whenever it came to Lamentations, whenever I'd look at that, I would see how dark the text appeared to be, and I thought the subject matter was maybe just too much to set the entire work to music. Some have asked, well, what changed? What made you do that? Well, one of the main things was being in Jerusalem on October 7th, 2023, when the war with Hamas started. As I was in that area at that time, it had gone from a very hustle and bustle, busy city to being very silent. And the first verse of Lamentations just kept coming in my mind about this lonely city, this deserted city. And the quietness of this once busy city was even heightened by the fact that I could hear birds chirping. I could hear birds in a once busy downtown when all I could hear before was traffic. And that was really eerie to me. So I started thinking about setting this text to music despite how sobering it was. I was thinking, well, people sit through sad movies for about the same length of time all the time. This certainly is worth that, given the quality of the text, the highly sophisticated literature. It certainly has a lot of redeeming value even just from that. The Oratorio, I'm starting it with a brief representation of what an air raid siren sounds like. I have this cello like going up to this note right there, and then the trumpet comes in on that note, and this blare of sound comes out, and it's supposed to evoke this image of the air raid siren. And then after that, the flute comes in, and that's supposed to represent, you can hear birds. That's how desolate, that's how empty the city is. So that's one thing to listen for, just right at the front of the work. There's a scripture in the book of Jeremiah, not in Lamentations, but in Jeremiah. He's warning the city about this impending destruction, and he says something to the effect that you need to get your women ready to sing, and to sing songs of mourning. And he says those women need to be good at it. They need to be cunning. And so in the Oratorio, the first sounds you will hear in terms of what's being sung will come from the women. The altos will start, the sopranos will come in, and they're singing the Hebrew word echa, which means how, that opening exclamation of Lamentations. And then a little bit more about the roles in terms of which voices are being represented or how the voices are being used in the work. There is a soprano solo, and that is to represent and to personify the city being a victim of these atrocities. The desolate city is compared to a widow. It says she's become as a widow or like a widow. So that's what I've called that role. And then there's a tenor solo, and that represents the voice of the prophet Jeremiah. And he had his own personal eyewitness reactions that you hear in the text that's being sung. And then sometimes you hear him conveying God's message. And so that leads to the third solo role, which is the baritone, which I've called the Lord. And that represents the voice of the deity, the voice of God, speaking to or through the prophet. And often you'll hear the tenor and the baritone singing duets. One will be singing in the original biblical Hebrew, and the other will be singing in an English rendering or an English translation of that. And that's another unique thing about this work, is just that the bilingual aspect. There are voices that are singing in one language and then other voices answering in another language. So you get to hear the poetry, the Hebrew poetry, but then also you get to hear the English. In addition to those three soloists, we have a chorus as well, which sometimes gives this group feel, and maybe the pronouns, like we are feeling this, something like that. The choir really adds to that effect. And then sometimes, she sings in the original biblical Hebrew and the choir sings in English, or vice versa. And then that helps present her vantage point. Then there's also groups of people who sing in the text who are clearly mocking those who've been victimized. So there's a few verses in Lamentations that talk about, we're really glad this has happened. And so there's this mocking element as well. So the choir will sometimes assume those roles of the text. And that's actually, sometimes there's even cheerier music amid all this kind of dirge-like music. There's some cheerier things, and that's to represent people singing these mocking songs about what's happened to Jerusalem. And even one of the verses mentions them clapping and hissing. And so there's actually a movement in here where the choir will clap and they will also hiss at certain moments. So in addition to singing, just traditional choral singing, the choir is also being asked to, clap certain rhythms and even hiss at certain times. One other aspect to the roles being sung, there's the children's chorus. And it's more like a youth chorus because there's a few young teenagers in it, and maybe they wouldn't want to be called children, but it's a younger chorus. And the Lamentations text mentions children in several places. There's a verse where they ask, why isn't there any food? And so I thought, well, this needs to be conveyed in the voice of children or younger voices so that we can hear that. Now, also in the work, there's several themes that reoccur throughout in the text. As a composer, those are things I latch onto because I want to convey the same things musically as the piece progresses, and then the listeners can hear those themes repeated. There's this theme of weeping. There's this. That theme comes around again and again because that theme of, my eyes are just like rivers of tears, that comes back. And so that theme will recur through the oratorio. There's this image in the text of her gates. It says the city's gates are sunk into the ground. And the music represents this idea of something just being very heavy. So there's that element as well. There's also the theme of the victims being hunted, them feeling chased, persecuted. Even the meaning of the word persecution in this case is being pursued. And there's verses that say, all her pursuers overtook her between the narrow straits. That's the first time we see that theme. Another verse says, my enemies chased me sore like a bird, or they hunted me. So this comes up a few times, them being hunted by something swifter than eagles. And the music in these places will obviously represent the quick nature of the chase. The first time we get this theme in the text, it is a musical device called a fugue, which actually comes from a word meaning chase. And so a fugue, in the musical sense, is a section of the choir, in this case, presents a line, and then the other sections of the choir sing that same line in kind of a round. So you have this feeling musically of the chase. The notes are being chased by other notes. This all her pursuers overtook her between the narrow straits. The basses sing that, and then the tenors come in and they sing that, and then the altos come in, and so on. So the choir, there's this feeling of a chase. Now, even in all of this, there's still this theme of great hope, and this comes right in the middle of the entire book. And in terms of the oratorio, this comes slightly after the beginning of the second half of the oratorio. It's movement 20 out of 33 movements total, and it's called Hope. And there's no orchestra in this movement, and that is the only movement like that. So I believe this adds a layer of intimacy to that. So that's something to listen for as well. There's so many other themes and melodies and things that will hopefully help the ear tie everything together. I condensed a lot of those themes into a 5-movement cello suite, which is available to listen to even ahead of the premiere and available online. So I can put a link for that so you can listen to that and just absorb even some of the melodic ideas, the material there. One motive I think that's worth mentioning is this kind of oscillating thing in the harp. This motive in the harp, you might call it an ostinato. And that keeps happening over and over again. I'll bring that up here in a second. There's also one more device to mention. I mentioned earlier that the poetry is structured as an acrostic, meaning every verse starts with the next letter of the Hebrew alphabet. And I was thinking, well, what's a way to represent that musically? And so one thing that does happen where if a movement contains several verses, several alphabetical escalations, if you will, I made the music to where there would be a key change where it would feel like the energy was heightened. Just like you feel like, well, you get to the next letter of the alphabet, okay, we're progressing. For instance, in movement 10, we have so that's a theme in that movement, and then later in the movement, we go to the next letter of the alphabet, and I use the same musical material, but I do it a half step higher. So that's just one thing to listen for as well. Now, the final verse of Lamentations, it's a really interesting verse. It often in some English translations, they present it as a question. And at the very least, it feels like an uncertain ending. And in the final movement, after I've finished setting the text, I wanted to create this kind of open-ended feeling, but I also wanted to feel like we were finishing. And there's an element of hope right before that question is asked where it says to renew us. So this word renew or chadesh in the Hebrew, I present that word over and over in what we would call the very tail end of the work, or the coda of the piece. And here we simply repeat the most hopeful word from these final couple of verses in both Hebrew and English. And to present this final section, that ostinato I told you about before, that ostinato, I bring it back here at the very end, but it's reharmonized now as we sing the word renew and chadesh over and over, where it sounds more hopeful. And then I lean into the fact at the very end that the book feels somewhat open-ended at its conclusion. So I use this inverted chord to give this slight sense of non-finality. So it ends with this chord. Now, in most musical settings, you would end with one of these notes would be on the bottom. That sounds very final. But in this case, I end like this. The choir is singing that. It's just the voices right at the very end, and then that just fades out. And so that's something to listen for. So those are just a few of the themes, a few of the ideas, a little bit of the backstory of what went into this. You can go and listen to the cello suite if you just want to hear more of just some of the melodies and that type of thing. But hopefully this just gives a little bit of the story to help appreciate this as you experience it for the first time.